Chapter 1 is going to be covering violent crime, including things like homicide, assault, and robbery. And I just want to remind you guys that it's the violent crime that really keeps us afraid and fearful, or keeps the public afraid and fearful. And it's often what drives those really tough on crime policies. And as I mentioned in previous chapters, politicians will often use this to make themselves look instrumental. And so, if they're up for re-election, they're going to want to make themselves look like, they're actually doing something, and locking people away is doing something. And it's really breeding on those, those fears that people have. Hey, I'm gonna make your family safe. You're gonna be okay. And thus, that's how we ended up with such long incarceration rates in the United States. So the definition of interpersonal violence includes the threat. So you don't actually have to be physical with someone. You can just, threaten them or threaten to be physical. The attempt, so it doesn't have to follow through, but, if you try and it doesn't follow through, it's still considered interpersonal violence. And then as well as the use of physical force that will result in physical injury, but also it can result in non-physical injury, because obviously if you are threatened by someone, it's going to create a lot of fear and anxiety in yourself if you're being stalked or followed, or whatever it is, threatened. And so you have that. And it doesn't always have to be an individual thing. So, if corporations, for instance, emit so many pollutants that, they're creating, a certain situation in which could be harmful to many groups of people, it could be considered violent. Um, in regards to unsafe products or something like that. If you remember the runaway Toyotas, I think it was a while ago now, at least 8 or 9 years ago. They were never able to say that Toyota knew about that. But if Toyota did know that this was going on and they failed to fix the problem or to let people know who were driving these Toyotas that this was a possibility that could happen, obviously it's very violent, because these people ended up, crashing to their deaths because their car, wouldn't stop accelerating. And of course, I would see that as a pretty violent way to die and a pretty scary way to die. And so, just think outside of the box. Oftentimes, Hollywood kind of blurs our ideas of what is considered violent and not. But of course, if a corporation knows what it's doing, and knows that it could be inflicting harm on other people, it definitely is considered violent. The other side of that is that oftentimes it's really hard to pin down who was responsible for this act, who knew about it and who didn't. It's obvious that you can't, lock up Ronald McDonald or the Michelin Man or all of these fictional characters that represent these different corporations, but generally it is a group of people who probably do know what's going on. Firestone got in trouble. I think it was Firestone. Yeah, Firestone got in trouble with tires. They knew that after once the tires hit a certain speed, that they would start unraveling. And people, of course, once you got over 80 or 90 miles an hour, your tires unraveling would be a very dangerous situation, and many people died. But of course, Goodyear decided that it was just a better situation to pay off the people who had died than it would be to um, recall all of those tires. And of course, that is a criminal offense, because it's a very violent thing to put people through. And, it kind of traces back to the structural conditions of capitalism and kind of profit at any cost. Also, something to think about when reflecting on violent crime. This could also include things like political violence, tyranny, terrorism, or genocide. Most people, when they think of genocide, they refer to the Holocaust, and of course, that was one of the worst case scenarios. 6 million Jews were, and others, were exterminated. But a lot of people don't recognize that there was also the Armenian genocide, and there were over 2 million people who were killed. And even to this day, there is some criticism of Turkey, who doesn't completely come out and recognize that this actually happened. And of course, for Armenians, you can understand why this would be a source of tension for them. This horrible thing happened to their people, and the country who was responsible for it still doesn't openly state that this really happened. So let's go over some of our objectives for this chapter. So first, we want to be able to define homicide and assault, be familiar with its patterning and social dynamics, and the recent trends in U.S. homicide rates, as well as help to understand the major explanations for homicide and aggravated assaults. We want to be able to define robbery, be familiar with its extent, patterning and costs, and be able to identify the types of robbers, as well as become familiar with major explanations for robberies as well as carjackings. We want to be familiar with the special topics in violent crime discussed in the text, including mass murder and serial killing, workplace violence, hate crime, mass media and violence, and guns and gun control. We also want to be familiar with what history tells us about reducing violent crime and recent suggestions for doing so. So the first violent crime that we're going to be discussing is homicide. Obviously, homicide is probably what gets the most attention. Interesting, and I think it's just common sense, but homicides are much more likely to become known to police because generally there is a body. And obviously that's another part of the crime, is that, you have to do something with this body. And that's what differs, with assault or anything else. Obviously, you don't have to hide anything. So when defining homicide, homicide is the willful killing of one individual by another. Keep in mind that it does not always have to be criminal. So in the case of self-defense, if the evidence shows that you are legitimately defending yourself or your family, you cannot be held criminally liable, but it still takes, they will investigate that to make sure. If a police kills in self-defense, obviously, if the evidence suggests that their life was really in danger, of course, that would not be criminal. As well as if it's an accident, right, it would not be criminal. And even in a time of war, right, a soldier kills if they have to, right, and obviously that would not be considered criminal. So before we start off looking at the different types of homicide, I just want to be really clear that there's a lot of gray area in these categories. Because of course it depends on the killer, it depends on the intent, and it depends on the amount of physical force used. So what stereotypically might look like a first-degree murder, sometimes, that person might not be charged with first-degree murder. They might be charged with second-degree murder. If you are familiar, most of you are familiar with the OJ case. About midway through the OJ case, Judge Ito, actually, and this was a big blow for the defense, but he actually said that he would let the jurors consider or introduce the idea of, allowing this to be a second-degree murder. If you know anything about the case, it's very clear for the most part. OJ went to kill Nicole. I mean, he even wrote a book about how he would do it if he did it, right? Anyways. But it's really hard to think that, someone would go to someone's house with a knife and gloves and a hat and all this stuff, and that wouldn't, give enough evidence to say that this was premeditated. There is some gray area. Ron Goldman, we don't know. He happened to be there. That might look more like second-degree murder, right? OJ went to go kill Nicole. Ron Goldman was there. Ron Goldman was just at the wrong place at the wrong time. OJ didn't intend to kill him. He only wanted to kill his wife. But he was there. And so, with Ito introducing that, again, it was a big blow to the defense, but it was kind of a compromise because, before they had to say, hey, this is all or nothing. It's first-degree murder. He went in there with full premeditation. He knew what he was doing. So this allowed for a little bit of a compromise, and, and maybe certain jurors might have considered that as, well, I don't think it was first-degree murder, but I don't think he should be let off completely. And so, just because a certain case might look a certain way doesn't mean that that's the way it's going to pan out. Obviously, you have to have the evidence to be able to prove this. There have been many cases where people believed, later jurors would say they totally felt this person was guilty. They just didn't think that the prosecution, presented the case in a way that, was beyond a reasonable doubt. But so for this, just so you know that, but for this, we'll look at the kind of the stereotypical difference of premeditation. So with first-degree murder, this is where an offender has planned or premeditated this offense. So imagine, maybe people are, neighbors are in a fight or something like that, and it's kind of the last straw. Someone did something to piss someone off. A person goes and grabs their gun and walks to the other side of, their property or whatever it is and shoots that person. for the most part, I think the defense would be able to, or the prosecution would be able to prove, in the time that it took this person to get the gun, they had the aforethought. They had enough time to sit there and realize, yeah, I'm going to go do this right now. It wasn't so much in the heat of passion, meaning like for a normal person, right, there will be situations or are situations in our life that, you don't necessarily plan out. Walking in on your wife or husband having sex with someone else, and you just immediately jump on these people and try to kill them, right? But if you try to kill them the next day, or in some cases there have been times where the prosecution said, hey, this person walked downstairs, got a gun, that was enough time for them to kind of think about it. So it's not like everyone's sitting at home drawing schematics, but of course that's the gray area in the law. It's not always, the stuff isn't always easy. But generally for first degree murder, that's going to be planned and premeditated. And of course, the punishment's going to be as severe. So in some states, those people might, get the death penalty or life in prison or whatever. But it's going to be the most punitive of the punishments in regards to murder. Second degree murder, there are a couple different things that could happen. This is where the offender intended to harm, but maybe killed instead. So let's say, for instance, those neighbors, instead of him grabbing a gun and walking over there, maybe he walked over there and was gonna, kick his ass or whatever it is. And in the process of doing this, maybe he punched him, the guy fell, um, hit his head and died. And that would be considered more of a second degree murder. So you intended to do a lot of harm, but kill the victim. And of course, with medical technology and things like that, people are living a lot longer. And so what 50 years ago would have been a murder because, medicine couldn't fix it or technology couldn't fix it, now might be just considered aggravated assault. So with technology and things like that, it's changing things. An ambulance, for instance, um, before the age of that, it would take people a lot longer to find medical treatment and care. Another situation is voluntary manslaughter. So voluntary manslaughter is killing out of intense anger or fear. Um, so this might be the situation where, again, you do this knowingly, but maybe you are in fear for your own life. So, for instance, you kill because you walk in and see someone hurting your child, or this is the case for a lot of battered women, right? They voluntarily killed because it was one of those situations. It's kill or be killed, right? And of course, the evidence has to support that as well. Um, and I just want to be clear too that there are all different kinds of scenarios. I'm just naming a few of, generally kind of the stereotypical cases. Um, but it's not always easy to, to figure these out. Second degree murder, another case of that might be, for instance, you're walking down the street, you bump into someone, they pull out a gun and kill you over it. Like that kind of stuff does happen. You can tell there's probably no premeditation, but it's also not a crime of passion, because most ordinary people would not do that, right? Most ordinary people would just say, okay, this guy's a jerk or whatever. They wouldn't go and kill over that. So that would kind of be the difference between like the heat of passion. And of course, a crime of passion would be most likely to be second degree, meaning you did not intend to do this. You did not intend to um, kill them, right? Um, and then lastly, we have involuntary manslaughter. The next one, I'm sorry, kind of a little funky there on my recording. So sorry if it's repeating. The next one we'll look at is voluntary manslaughter or homicide. And this is where generally the offender is acting very recklessly. So they didn't go out, with the intent. There was no intent to try to kill someone, but rather they were acting recklessly. So think of someone who's out, I don't know, firing a shotgun just for fun after a Seahawks game, or after, whatever it is, and on accident they shoot someone, shoot a neighbor, or shoot someone, a kid, or whatever it is. They didn't mean to do that, but of course, because they were acting so recklessly, it did, end up being a murder or homicide. And again, you can have that neglect to leaving a baby in a car, speeding at high rates, a DUI. they've actually kind of uh, made those punishments a little harsher because they can actually say that you did have some intent when you get into a car under the, intoxicated. So they might try to get you for second degree homicide um, even though it kind of fits more of the involuntary homicide. So it really just depends on the situation and the case and, the prosecution. So here we'll look at some patterns of homicide. And again, don't forget about that gray area. A lot of times it might depend on the type of sentence you get, might even depend on your past. So we were talking about vehicular manslaughter earlier, where someone would kill someone while they're drinking and driving. That's one example. You could even be just super distracted being on your phone or something like that. Of course, being on your phone versus being drunk, people are probably not going to look at it as severe. But let's say, for instance, you are an individual who's on like their fourth or fifth DUI. There have been plenty of chances for you to, to know of the repercussions of your actions and things like that. There have been cases where people will get really, really punitive sentences just based on, their own history. And of course, one of the biggest predictors is the state that you live in. So some states, are much more punitive than others. So just keep that in mind. Okay, when it comes to things like patterns of homicide, so let's look at some of these here. The first one we'll reflect on is geography. So we know that homicide is higher in urban areas than in rural areas. Part of that is because just the density of population in urban areas, you have a lot more people living in a small area, and of course, that creates more tension. If you've ever shared a room with a sibling, you know this. We also know that it's more likely to push people out into the streets, right? Because you have lots of people living or families living together. There's probably not as much room, right? We also know that from a geographical sense, homicide is highest in the South. We can reflect on that and look at things like the racial and economic inequality in the South, as well as really, a really violent past. The South has one of the most violent pasts regionally in the U.S., as well as still a lot of racial tension and historically a lot of racial tension. So geography really plays into that. And other things in regards to things like culture, we can look at the history of slavery in the South. That in some ways this made people accustomed to things like violence and lynchings and things like that. We also know that the South has warmer weather, and we know that the warmer the weather, especially when it comes to violent crime, the more likely people are to get upset because they're probably not feeling so great. The South also has much higher rates of gun ownership, so that's another explanation. So not all of these, explain the high rates, but I think as a combination, it kind of works a little bit to show kind of the differences. So, according to the Uniform Crime Report, if you remember, those are the stats that are garnered from police agencies, law enforcement, things like that. Generally, we find that there is a relationship between the victim and the offender. So, when looking at patterns of homicide and victim offender relationship, and again, this is where sometimes, like, even the stats aren't necessarily representing what's actually going on. So, according to the UCR, which is the Uniform Crime Report, those stats that come out from law enforcement, generally it states that there is no relationship between the victim and the offender, that it's unknown, do these people know each other or not. But usually what ends up happening is, the report is filed initially and they don't know if there's a relationship at all, but generally that's something that they find out later on, and it's kind of a simple kind of just error in that a lot of times they won't go back and kind of change the records of the initial report. But it's reported that, most people, between 45 and 77% of people actually knew the offender. The chances of being, murdered by a random stranger, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's pretty rare. It would be pretty random for it to happen because again, someone needs a motive, and if they're really, murdering you just completely randomly, there isn't much motive. That's maybe where you see cases of mental health and things like that. Um, but generally there's a reason someone wants you dead. It's just not a random thing. So other types of patterns that we see, pull these up here. So victim and offender generally will know each other. Um, there is, in 2/3 of cases, a use of a weapon is used, and about half the time a handgun is used. So, a weapon can essentially be anything we stereotypically think of, a gun or a knife, but you can use a frying pan to kill someone if you wanted to. But most of the time, about 2/3 of the time, a weapon is used in the case of a homicide. And again, that could be a rope, that could be anything that you use to kill someone. Um, what else? You also see things like gang activity. Oftentimes, when it comes to gangs, from an outside perspective, things look pretty senseless. But of course, gang members will receive status for murdering, especially other gang members. And so, even though it's hard for people on the outside to kind of understand motives on that end, there are motives. Status, you move up in the gang, um, even in prison culture and things like that. So. Lastly, one more dynamic that I just want to mention is usually, like, again, it's not something random, and usually there's some kind of tension between these people. I know it seems common sense, but just want to say it. And generally, it's not just someone pulls out a gun randomly. It's just kind of like how you get in a fight with anyone. There's a verbal attacks back and forth, and then, someone pulls out their gun. I always remember hearing about that case, or a case when I was working under parole, reading it. And it was essentially two friends who were out drinking in the parking lot together, got in a fight. One of them pulled out a gun and killed the other one, right? I don't think this person intended on this. Probably intended on having a good time with their buddy. Someone said something to piss them off, and that was it. So, generally, you will find those types of dynamics that there's some back and forth going on. It's not just a real quick thing. There's some tension that's grown between these people. So here's some of the stuff that you know about homicide from previous chapters, and good news, right? So homicides rates are have declined significantly since the 1990s. It rose a little bit in the 1960s. Some of the reasons for that were there was also, there was a lot of tension during this time, a lot of despair and anger resulting from things like globalization, so outsourcing, people losing jobs, not having the same types of opportunity that maybe they did before. During this time, there was also an increased possession of handguns. A lot of that had to do with drug trafficking, right? And of course, what used to be in the 1950s an old school fashioned fist fight, now with guns, could be a lot more lethal. So some of these trends are holding up still to this day, and you know, we're seeing a decline overall. So some of the reasons for the decline: fewer gang wars. It's just not as a tumultuous relationship as it was in the early 1990s. We also see what's known as improved policing, right, and strategic policing and hotspots and things like that, but also that increase in imprisonment. And as I mentioned earlier, increase in medical technologies, right? What used to be a murder in 1960s might not, because we have such great technology at this point. We can save a lot more lives than maybe we used to in the past. Generally, when it comes to victimization rates, and we talked about this in chapter 4, but we do see that young black males are most likely to be victimized by, or to be murdered, sadly enough. Okay, now we'll discuss aggravated assault and simple assault. So generally with aggravated assault, you really mean to do or inflict great and severe bodily harm or injury. Most of the time with aggravated assault, there is the use of a weapon. So this is, aggravated assault is really, it aligns with homicide too. It's like if that assault was getting worse, this person might have died. It could depend on the person. Maybe they have good genes. Who knows? Um, but generally, obviously, during an aggravated assault, the person does not die, but maybe the possibility of it was there. You see the use of a weapon oftentimes with aggravated assault. Simple assault, this is kind of that, no weapons used, not a lot of great bodily injury, that old school. fist fight type mentality. So, some of the patterning in regards to victimization, who becomes victims of aggravated assault. Again, strangers do commit these, but it's not often. When it is done by a stranger, it's more likely to happen to a male. Women are much more likely to be assaulted by people they know. But again, those are kind of go against what we generally, the messages we receive as women, especially that, strangers are out there to get us. Not to say it doesn't happen, it does happen. But again, the dynamics involved with aggravated assault are very similar to homicide. Really, the only difference is really the fate of the victim. And so, what I said for homicide is going to be kind of similar to what I'm going to say about aggravated assault. So, since the 1990s, aggravated assault is actually down. It generally involves people you know, and about a fourth of all aggravated assaults include some type of gun. And of course, this makes um, certain crimes more lethal. So let's look at some of the explanations for homicide and assault. And so these are just ideas that theorists have had as to why people commit these. And there are quite a few. So the whole idea of inequality, what's known as relative deprivation, the idea that some groups in our culture are not doing as well. This will lead to anger and things like turf wars, right? Because when there is new economy, people create their own economies, and of course, um, they are still in conflict over the scarce resources that they have within those cities or towns. Another explanation for homicide and assault is handgun ownership. So about a third or 29% of Americans own a handgun. And it's interesting because most of the guns, there is a gun for every man, woman, and child, but only about 30% of homes have them. And so essentially, 30% of people have multiple guns is what they're getting at. When you compare places like Europe, only about 10% of people in Europe own a gun. And even in the UK, for example, I'm forgetting the name of Bobbies. I forget the name of what they call the cops, but they don't carry guns, probably because most of the citizens aren't carrying them as well. So we can also look. Oops, I didn't mean to look at handgun ownership. We can also look at the history of violence. So historically, we are very violent. We have a long history of wars. Of course, our how we became independent from Great Britain was violent, right? There was a lot of violence against slaves, violence against women and children, especially as seen as accepted solutions for problems. And this is even true to this day. Sometimes people, it is up to the parents whether they want to spank their kids or something like that. And there's a lot of gray area when it comes to that. In regards to the law, in California at least, the rule is that you're not allowed to leave a mark. Well, it's kind of hard to figure out whether you're going to leave a mark or not. And so I think as a just precaution, you should only spank your children when you are in control of your own emotions, so that um, you don't overdo it, because we know that you don't want to take out on your kid what your boss did to you all day just because your kid's being annoying when you get home. But sadly, I think that it does happen. And so, sometimes that's the case. There's also, in regards to the history of violence, we are a rugged individualistic culture. Sometimes there's a distrust of authority, so people will oftentimes take the law into their own hands because they don't think, law enforcement or the legal system is really going to, do its best. Another explanation for homicide and assault would be social disorganization and anomie. So we discussed this a little bit in the beginning of the course, but things like population density, a lot of people living on top of each other, household overcrowding, weak social ties within certain communities, institutional discrimination, meaning finding, discrimination or inequality within institutions like education or even, law enforcement, things like that. as well as in certain areas there are very high levels of unemployment, meaning there's just not a lot of industry happening in these places. And so, the industry is depressed and oftentimes leaving the people kind of feeling the same way. The next one we'll look at is gender differences. So obviously via the socialization process, people are taught kind of their gender roles and things like that. And as we've mentioned before, men are really socialized, to first of all be protectors, to be breadwinners. And when their, masculinity is threatened, or maybe they don't feel like they are being the breadwinner because maybe structurally they don't have the opportunity to be successful in a culture, it is possible that this could help explain why males commit aggravated assault and homicide rates at much higher rates. The next one we'll look at is anger and despair, and I think this explains a lot why African Americans are more likely to be perpetrators of violent crime as well as victims of violent crime. And so I think we can really relate their situation back to that social disorganization and anomie, right? Population density, household overcrowding, things like that. Another explanation would be self-defense or retaliation. This is especially true for women, battered women, people who are being abused or hurt by others. And then lastly, we can look at social process factors. So social process looks at how people process certain, how they process their social world. And again, that's all determined by our own experiences every day. We change as a person. And so, as children, we learn norms for justifying violence. If you ever, a lot of your parents probably told you, hey, don't be the first to throw the first punch, but don't be the first one to hit the ground. And so in some ways we do socialize children into violence. I think it's getting a little bit better. But even, some of the games my daughter watches or the video games I've noticed that are intended for, smaller children, I'm like, wow, this is a little interesting. I'm not sure I want you really watching this one or something like that. And, she's cool with it, but it's just kind of interesting that, again, we give, killing toys that are essentially knives and guns and things like that to small children, and then we say don't do that later on. So the next crime we will look at will be robbery, and robbery is taking or attempting to take anything of value from care, custody, or control of a person by force or threat of force. And so that's really a big determinant in deciding that this is robbery. So burglary, if you break into someone's house, that can be seen as using force. But if it's a home invasion robbery, you might have someone, with a gun, telling you, give me all of your stuff, as opposed to it being kind of more of a secret thing, right? And so it can also be the threat of force. So there have been many cases where people will put their finger in their pocket to make it look like a gun. Then they say, well, I didn't really have a gun. Well, the shopkeeper or whoever it is didn't know that. And so you are still, going to be held to the same kind of standards in regards to punishment as the person who actually had the gun, because no one really knows. They feel like they're being threatened. And so robbery, first of all, is the most interracial crime, meaning happening amongst different races, because again, most crime is intraracial, meaning black on black, white on white, Asian on Asian, whatever. But generally the background is this is a combination of theft and interpersonal violence. So you've kind of learned a little bit about those so far. So let's look at some of the extent, patterning, and costs of robbery. So looking at some of the patterns, again, robbery is going to be very similar to the other violent crimes in regards to dynamics. Some of the things that are a little bit different. Generally, what we find is robbery is more interracial for white victims, right? Meaning they're being robbed by someone of a different race. When it comes to black victims, it's more likely to be intraracial, meaning they are being robbed by someone of their own race. And again, blacks are most likely to be victims, males as well. So, robbery is more of a young person's crime. One of the biggest differences here is that, it's most likely to be done by a stranger. That's going to be one of the biggest differences when compared to aggravated assault or homicide. And in most cases of robbery, a large percentage of robberies are using a gun or other weapon. So here for our next slide, we'll look at the different types of robberies. Your first kind of typology is known as the professional. The professional robbers will carefully plan out. These are people looking for big stakes. They're really looking for a big payout here. They're organized. They carry guns. They work in groups. These are professional robbers. They are people who, do this pretty much for a living, most likely career criminals. And so, again, they're going to be very professional in the same way you would see in other industries, very strategic, planned out. And all right, so the next one is the opportunist, and it's in the name. So this is generally young males targeting people maybe walking at night. And again, it's a crime of opportunity, meaning I only decided to rob you because I noticed you were wearing this, a Rolex, or I noticed this woman with, her purse by herself in the middle of the night or something like that. So it's a crime of opportunity. They're only doing it because it's in front of them. Then you have robberies done by the addict population, and of course, it's probably makes sense that the addicts are using whatever they rob, or the loot that they get to buy drugs. Of course, these robberies are less skilled, less planned, and probably a lot more sloppy. They're probably a lot more likely to be caught as well. And then lastly, kind of along the same lines of as the addict, you have your alcoholic. And again, you can only imagine how precise you're going to be if you are drinking while doing something like this. And again, probably more likely to be caught, and oftentimes doing this to get more booze. And it might not be a major robbery, but again, it's still a thing that we see. So here we have some explanations for robbery. The first one is economic gain. I don't think I need to explain that too much. Violent crime is committed for economic gain. People are trying to get something out of this. The next explanation we'll look at is Merton's innovation. So these are people who are considered innovators. If you remember strain theory and adaptations to anomie, certain people will adapt to the society that requires that they, become something, and if they decide not to become something in legitimate means like going to school or working their way up, they want to be something for doing something criminal or illegitimate. So this is just an adaptation to that. So society placing value on success, people turning to crime, especially robbery, right? Because you get economic gain out of that. The next one we can look at as an explanation for robbery would be urban neighborhoods. So again, kind of going back to stuff we talked about before, you have a lot of extreme poverty in certain areas and a lot of social disorganization. Lastly, you have people committing robberies to gain respect. This helps explain gang mentality, certain people wanting kind of a badass identity, looking cool, having a lot of money, having status, getting girls, that type of thing going on. So next we have carjacking, and carjacking became very big in the 1980s. It's just another form of robbery where someone forces you out of your vehicle and then goes ahead and takes it. I think it's less popular for obvious reasons. It's a lot harder. Now you have things like those police helicopters who can follow you. It's considered a violent crime, so you're putting a lot, remember that hedonistic calculus, you're putting a lot on the line by doing something like this. And then, a lot of people have LoJack. They have all of these different systems that keep, people from doing this type of thing. So not as big as it used to be anymore. I suppose it still happens, but just not as big because I think the benefits don't really outweigh the costs, or the consequences. Next, we're going to discuss hate crimes and workplace violence. And so a hate crime is any type of violent crime in which a person is targeted because of their religion or their sexual orientation or their race. Um, throughout history, we've seen hate crimes in regards to like the KKK or mob violence, skinheads and neo-Nazis, as well as a lot of certain groups being targeted, such as LGBT groups, as well as especially African Americans. And African Americans are the #1 target of hate crimes. When you intersect that with LGBT African Americans, they have even higher rates of hate crimes. If you remember, years ago, there was a young boy named Matthew Shepard who was kind of coaxed into going home with these two people who ended up, beating him so badly and tying him to a fence and left him to die. And Matthew Shepard really became kind of the face of all of this going on, of all of this violence towards these particular groups. And so he really kind of, if his murder did anything, it was, came to light that, this sort of discrimination and hate still exists, and people are definitely, certain people have to walk around and be a little bit more careful about, the spaces that they go into. So the next time, or the next topic we'll look at is workplace violence. In the 1980s, workplace violence became very, it was kind of like what we see in school shootings now. The idea of going postal became very, very popular because it was a postal worker who, initially where it started, getting more attention and things like that. He kind of went crazy. But, workplace violence can be like any type of estranged lovers coming in, confronting. So here we'll cover other types of violent crimes. The first one is often one that Hollywood likes to follow, and the media as well, and that's known as mass murder. And mass murder is generally where lots of people are murdered, in kind of one session. Another kind of term for this is spree killing. Oftentimes in these types of situations of spree killing, and sadly some of the stuff we've seen lately, San Bernardino, Columbine, the Oregon shooting at the college. Generally, what we see is this pattern where at the end the assailant will go ahead and commit suicide. And people have all different reasons for committing these acts. Sometimes they're just really aggrieved. Sometimes it's an act of revenge, as in what happened with Columbine, which is really the kind of the first one that really got people paying attention. And sadly, we've seen a lot of kind of similar things happen. But and most of the mass murders are male, kind of going along with those same patterns that we see within violent crime. Next, you have serial killers. The major difference between serial killing and mass murder is serial killing takes place over a period of time. So maybe a person kills a person one day, and then the next week they go for another person. But it's not like a spree shooting where many people are taken out over the same time. Even though it gets a lot of attention in Hollywood and in the media, serial killers are really rare. Generally, oftentimes they go after people who they believe, won't be missed. For instance, like prostitutes or hitchhikers, something like that. And of course, there are different types of serial killers. You have people who are on a mission. And in this, maybe it might be tied to ideas of terrorism. There's even financial serial killing. And then, people who are insane or they're hearing voices or something like that. But generally, within these, you'll see a lot of violence, or you'll see a lot of weapons used. And, there are all different types of explanations, but a lot of times just these people like dominating. And so, yeah, another kind of sad situation, but it's kind of the world we live in. Next, we'll look at violence against children. And so, again, as you know, violence is most likely to happen within the home. And because of the socialization process and some of the norms within our culture, violence against children is sometimes overlooked as just kind of commonplace or whatever. Like I said, in the state of California, at least, if you have a mark on your body, that's what authorities kind of consider over the line. And of course, there are mandated reporters, school teachers, and people that work in the systems with children who are mandated to report any type of child abuse that they might see. Really interesting, kind of the history of child abuse. We actually had safety nets for animals before we had safety nets for children. So one of the first cases of abuse happened with a young girl. Her name was Marianne something, I forgot the last name. But you know, it was neighbors who initially had figured that, you know, something was going on and that she was being abused, and there weren't any resources or, you know, child abuse hotlines or anything like that. So they ended up calling the ASPCA, which is, you know, generally for dogs, and that's how authorities got involved. But we actually had, you know, kind of safety nets for animals before we had safety nets for children. And obviously, children are vulnerable to this type of abuse because of kind of the power dynamics involved in, you know, children and parents. Next, we've talked a little bit about mass media and violence, but generally, you know, a lot of sociologists will contend that for certain individuals, all of this exposure to violence in the media somehow normalizes certain individuals, especially with things like video games and some really violent movies. Of course, if you think about the Colorado movie theater shooting, that person, you know, it's hard to deny that he wasn't influenced by Hollywood. He, you know, went into a Batman movie and started, you know, doing these horrible things, killing people. So, and when it comes to guns, generally guns are the weapon of choice. It makes sense that they can take out the most people in the least amount of time. Not to say that knives are never used, but guns are most likely to be used. Oftentimes you'll see that assailants will have whole arsenals. They'll have location plans and strategies and schematics and everything else. So this oftentimes is very much premeditated, and really a lot of forethought was put into it.